Hi there, my name's Bill Bergman. Welcome to Gov Money News. And this is a video. I'm doing videos about government finance for my website. I'm doing this video after a few days ago, I was looking over material on federal debt issues and stumbled over a 2004 monograph from the GAO about federal government debt, measuring it, what it was, and an update on their analysis of the federal debt. So I thought it'd be interesting to share my observations on that 2004 memo in light of current conditions and compare where we are today compared to when this memo was issued. So here we go. I got the PowerPoint up in front of you now. A December 2023 update on GAO's 2004 update on the federal debt. GAO, what is it? It's currently the Government Accountability Office, which is the chief audit arm of Congress. It was first established as the GAO in 1921, but back then it was called the Government Accounting Office. The name was changed by law, actually by Congress in 2004 to better reflect the mission of the agency. And it was interesting that that name change arrived coincident with the memo we're going to look at. It's just one memo, but the time that this memo was issued, the GAO was led by a fellow named David Walker, who was a very dynamic and I think prescient and valuable public servant who is still out there working on these issues today. What is the GAO though? It's intended to be, and it may not always work in this fashion, but our Congress is, got the power of the purse, and the GAO is an entity set up by a congressional law intended to provide an independent and nonpartisan source of audit, evaluation, and investigative services for the United States Congress. It's a pretty important position and office to have in a republic that we have today. There's a link to it here in the PowerPoint. The title of this monograph was Federal Debt: Answers to Frequently Asked Questions, an Update. The introductory message came from David Walker, the Comptroller General of the United States, the lead officer and accounting officer for the United States GAO office. He described in this monograph, in this introductory message, that he took note of the growth in debt, in the federal debt in the 1990s, which was, in his view, a little interesting in light of the rapid growth rate relative to what happens normally in the absence of war or recessions. In other words, debt was growing faster than it. And he took note of the fact that, debt was starting to rise significantly. In turn, in the 90s, there were some efforts underway in the late 1990s to reduce the deficit and had some success along those lines, depending on how you measure deficit. But in his monograph in 2004, he also recognized that those restrictions had been relaxed in the early 2000s. At the time he wrote this monograph, the debt held by the public, and we'll talk about that, had risen to 3.9 trillion, the then rather remarkable number, reaching 36% of the size of the economy, according to the government's measure of GDP, or gross domestic product. There's various ways to measure debt and government debt relative to the economy or relative to other measures, but this is just one of them to put a benchmark on how big the debt was relative to something. At the time, it was about $4 trillion and more than 1/3 of the size of the economy, at least for an annual gross domestic product number. In his message, he took note of future demographics for Social Security and Medicare, and had some forward-looking ideas about what they implied about the sustainability or lack thereof in federal government finances. And explicitly, he warned that the debt held by the public, and we'll talk about that. What is it? It had been rising, quote, to levels ultimately unsustainable by the U.S. economy. And some of the factoids in his introductory message included the fact that, again, debt held by the public had risen to 3.9 trillion, about a third of GDP. Debt held by government accounts, we'll talk about those, had risen to $2.9 trillion. And net interest interest expense for the federal government had become the sixth largest item in the federal budget, and roughly 7% of the total budget at the time he wrote this morning message. So in this Q&A that he updated and put together, and the GAO and his staff put together, here's section 1, and it's still a good framework to start thinking about similar topics that are of pressing interest today. How large is the federal debt? What is debt held by the public? What is debt held by government accounts? What is the difference between the different types of federal debt that are going to be discussed? How are they similar? How are they different? And finally, what is the, quote, debt limit, unquote? That's what we're going to cover today in light of what the numbers were back then and where are they today. So again, this was written in 2004 and the data was from 2003. And we're going to compare some of those numbers to where we are today. How large is the federal debt in 2022 versus 2003? Well, what are we talking about with the federal debt? There's various measures. One of them, and we're going to talk about, is the gross debt, which is equal to the debt held by the public. We'll define that, plus debt held by government accounts. And that gross debt number in 2003 was 3.9 trillion in terms of debt held by the public, plus debt held by government accounts of 2.9 trillion, or $6.8 trillion. So at the time that the GAO put out this updated information about the federal debt with some observations about reasons for concern about it, we were at 6.8 trillion in terms of this gross debt measure. Today, at least in 2022 anyway, the latest numbers that we have, that on the financial report of the U.S. government, that gross debt number has risen to a total of 29 trillion, based on 22.3 trillion in debt held by the public, plus 6.7 trillion in debt held by government account. In other words, the federal debt is quadrupled and rising twice as fast as GDP over the 20 years since this update was written back in 2004. Okay, our gross debt includes debt held by the public plus debt held by government accounts. What is debt held by the public, quote unquote? It's basically the value of all the debt securities, treasury securities sold, quote, to the public, unquote, that are still outstanding. And Walker described it as it represents basically the cumulative effect of past federal borrowing on today's economy and federal budget. It includes debt, however, held by the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve banks, which is a curious and perhaps debatable decision by the government to include debt held by the Fed in debt held by the public, but it's in there. And back in 2003, the debt held by the Fed was $660 billion, or about 17% of $3.9 trillion. By 2022, however, and you can make a long story behind this, and we'll talk perhaps about that down the road, the debt held by the Fed is quadrupled, reaching 40% of $6.9 trillion. How about debt held by government accounts? What is that, and where has that gone in the last 20 years? Basically, this is the stuff that's in what's called trust funds. And I put those in quotes for a reason. It's debatable whether they're really trust funds, but let's not get into that for now. The trust funds that accumulate surpluses for Social Security and Medicare, alleged surpluses anyway, because so far dedicated taxes exceed the spending for entitlement programs. And those amounts, and again, those are securities held by trust funds that represent effectively obligations of the United States Treasury to these government programs. That had reached 2.9 trillion in 2003. And then over the last 20 years, we've now risen to 6.6 trillion in debt held by government accounts. But this is a curious accounting exercise in thinking about what the implications then are and whether or not it really is or isn't debt. They're obligations of the Treasury, but they're also called intragovernmental debt. And those amounts, which are in the trust funds, effectively represent assets for government programs. It's government money that it owes to itself. And that's, in fact, one of the reasons the government doesn't include this amount in its debt on its balance sheet. A longer story. But, the idea that, is this really a debt? Well, one thing that we may have going for us, if that's what it is the fact that it's about to be depleted in the next decade, giving trends in demographics for Social Security and Medicare. But the fact that this debt over time, which is intragovernmental debt, is going to be depleted doesn't mean that that's a good thing. It has very important implications for federal debt as a whole. So publicly held debt versus government debt, and there's a section in the monograph that I looked at describing the two different types of debt and distinguishing them. Debt held by the public in this monograph's description was described as a burden on today's economy and taxpayers, at least back then, today, and it's reported as a liability on the federal government's balance sheet. Debt held by the public or the Treasury securities. Intragovernmental debt is a claim. It was described as a claim on future resources, one that doesn't theoretically affect today's economy and is not recorded as a liability on the balance sheet. Intragovernment, and Walker made this point, intragovernmental debt may not be on the balance sheet, but it still reflects a future burden on taxpayers in the economy. Having said that, he also took note, I think valuably, that, and here's the quote, trust fund balances, and therefore the intragovernmental debt, do not provide meaningful information about program sustainability. And he and others at the GAO put together and still report, and the federal government's financial report of the U.S. government now reports the present value of the unfunded future benefit costs in Social Security and Medicare. Perhaps that could be a better measure of debt, but that's not debt held by the public. It's also not intragovernmental debt, and it's also not on the balance sheet of the United States government. Maybe it should be, but that's a topic for another day. Well, what's happened to that present value as reported by the U.S. government, the amount that's not on the balance sheet, that's not in debt held by the public, that's not in the intragovernmental debt. In 2003, it was reported as a negative $21 trillion. By 2018, 5 years ago, in the current federal government's financial report, you can see statements of social insurance, and that's not on the balance sheet, but this number that was reported at $21 trillion back in 2003 was reported 5 years ago, or 6 years ago almost now, at $54 trillion. And today, or at least in 2022, in the latest statements, it's now at a negative $76 trillion. That's a lot bigger than the total gross debt. And again, gross debt is debt held by the public plus the intragovernmental debt. Okay, the next question that was addressed in that section 1 of that monograph, what is the debt limit? Well, the United States government has had a debt limit in theory, and it's a constraint on the gross debt in the U.S. government. Again, debt held by the public and intragovernmental debt. That's how the debt limit is written, to be a constraint on the gross debt, not on the other stuff, including the present value of entitlement programs I talked about. In 2003, the then current limit was $7.4 trillion. And the debt subject to the limit, in other words, how much debt was subject to this limit, was below the limit, like it should be if it's a limit. It was $6.7 trillion. What's happened since then to the debt limit? If it's a limit, you know, it sounds like it shouldn't change. It's a limit, but it's gone up a lot, and so has the debt subject to the limit. This is a link to a Congressional Research Service report in late 2022 about the federal debt and the debt limit. And they had a quote eerily similar to the observations in that 2003-2004 monograph from the GAO. Quote, federal debt is again reaching its statutory limit. Back then, it was a smaller number. Remember this number? It was $7.4 trillion. The current debt limit, and current is in quotes, in my view, for a reason, because it tends to change all the time. The current debt limit is now $31.4 trillion compared to that $7 trillion number back in 2003. It's 4 times as high as it was back in 2003. And not only that, the limit, which changes and goes up a lot every year as Congress sees fit, it doesn't even cover the present value of those entitlement programs. And it doesn't include that off-balance sheet entitlement debt. And that's north of $70 trillion, depending on how you measure it today. So again, here's some stuff to go take a look at it. You can find this by Googling this updated GAO report on the frequently asked questions about the federal debt. Some good questions for the future that were written 20 years ago that are worth exploring back then and today. What are key considerations for the future? How will the current fiscal policy path affect federal borrowing and budgetary flexibility? Does the debt limit provide a way to control the amount we borrow? What are some alternatives to the debt limit? Debt is one liability of the federal government. What are other potential ways to look at exposure or implicit commitments? These are some valuable questions that were being raised back in 2004, and we still are now facing the consequences of today. That was then, this is now, and what about the future? A longer story, but this is one chart that's in the financial report of the U.S. government, which has a harrowing picture of what the projections are under current law and policy for the debt held by the public that we were talking about. You can see those big increases from 2000 to 2022, but under current law and policy, things go exponentially higher over the next 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years under current law and policy and current expectations for demographic trends. In other words, whether or not this is sustainable, and the word sustainability and sustainable was raised by Walker in that 2004 monograph. So here's another way to think about our long-term prospects. Looking backwards anyway, from 2000 to 2022, what this chart is I just counted the number of times the word unsustainable appeared in the financial report of the U.S. government. And it's grown from less than 2 back when this monograph was being worked on, and then in 2004 it was in there 3 times. But look what's happened to the number of times they use the word unsustainable. And this relates to the federal government's own recognition and discussion of the unsustainable fiscal path of the U.S. government. I think a valuable and simple but important clue to what we're facing. All right, have a good day.